Ron Howard has spent a lifetime wearing the same mask in public, the calm smile, the steady voice, the reputation people repeat like a slogan, the nicest man in Hollywood. But when the news came that Rob Reiner was gone, that mask didn't crack. It shattered. This wasn't the kind of loss you file away with polite condolences. This wasn't a headline you scroll past and forget. For Ron, it felt like someone reached into his chest and tore something loose, something that had been there for more than half a century. And then, as if grief alone wasn't cruel enough, the details arrived. Not rumors, not whispers, police reports, horrific facts. Rob Reiner and his wife, Michele, stabbed multiple times. Their daughter, Romy, the one who witnessed what no child should ever have to see. No warning, no time to prepare. Just a brutal truth that drains the spirit the moment it touches you. People around Ron said he went quiet. Not the kind of quiet where you're resting, but the kind where your mind is screaming and your body doesn't know what to do with the noise. He sat there, staring into nothing, and the same question kept looping like a broken record. How could this possibly happen? Because when someone you've known for decades is suddenly reduced to a few cold lines of text, the brain fights it. It rejects it. It tries to bargain with reality. But reality doesn't bargain back. Ron had dealt with loss before. He thought he understood it. He thought time had trained him for it. Yet this time, he admitted something he almost never admits in public. He fell apart. Days of grief so heavy, there were moments he couldn't focus on anything at all. He wasn't just sad. He was undone. What made it worse, Ron said, wasn't even the headlines. It was what Rob had shared with him before the end. Not stories about films, not about success or fame, but private memories, family, love, the quiet worries of a father, the kind of truths that feel warm when you hear them in the moment, then become unbearable when that person is suddenly gone. Ron confessed that those words stayed with him like ghosts. He even admitted something that sounds almost cruel, but it was honest. He wished he had never heard certain things because they were too real, too painful, too human. The kind of pain that doesn't fade just because the cameras turn off. And then the shock doubled, because it wasn't only Rob. Michele was gone too, already carrying worry in his own life, already struggling with concerns about his brother Clint's health. Ron suddenly had to face the violent deaths of a longtime friend and a colleague he had always deeply respected. Every headline felt like a knife. Every article felt like someone reopening the wound on purpose. Rob Reiner dies at 78. Michele, 68, also gone. Rob's image kept flooding Ron's mind, the wit, the passion, the extraordinary talent, the laughter between takes, the conversations that just stretched late into the night. All of it now trapped in the past, replaying in his head like a film he couldn't pause. And this wasn't simply grief. It was psychological devastation, the kind that makes you feel hollow, powerless, and strangely guilty, as if you should have been able to stop it, as if friendship should come with some secret ability to protect the people you love. Ron remembered the moments they worked together, the creative discussions, the jokes that made them both laugh too hard. Now each memory felt sharper, as if it cut deeper because it was precious. Under the dim light of his living room, Ron tried to hold himself together. He put his head in his hands. He tried to control his breathing, but tears still came because the pain was too great to contain. It felt like the entire world had collapsed around him. leaving him standing in the middle of it with nowhere to lean. And that's when Ron did something unexpected. Just a few days after the funeral, he contacted Reuters directly, not to perform grief, not to craft a perfect statement, not to post a polished message for the world to approve. He wanted to speak plainly, candidly, as if he were talking to Rob himself one last time. When the interview began, Ron leaned back in his chair, shoulders hunched, as though he was trying to wrap his arms around himself, trying to withstand waves that wouldn't stop crashing. His face looked older than usual, etched with lines that grief carves deeper. His eyes were red, glassy, carrying a sea of tears that could spill at any moment. Every breath looked like effort. And when he finally spoke, his voice trembled with something Hollywood couldn't teach a man to act. He didn't even know where to begin, because, in his words, his heart felt shattered. Rob wasn't just a colleague, he was family in the world of cinema, and Ron still couldn't believe he was gone. As the Reuters interview continued, Ron Howard admitted something few people had ever heard him say out loud. He said the pain wasn't fading. It wasn't softening with time. If anything, it felt heavier with every passing day. Because Rob Reiner wasn't just someone he admired professionally. Rob had been a constant presence in his life for decades, a sounding board, a creative equal, a man whose opinions Ron trusted more than almost anyone else in Hollywood. They didn't just talk about movies. They talked about family, about aging, about fear, about the strange loneliness that can exist even at the top of the industry. Rob understood that loneliness. He knew how isolating success could feel, and he never pretended otherwise. Ron said that when he lost Rob, he didn't just lose a friend, he lost a part of his emotional foundation. The realization hit him late one night, sitting alone, replaying old conversations in his head. The jokes that once made him laugh now brought tears. The advice Rob had given him, advice he took for granted at the time, suddenly felt priceless and irreplaceable. And then there was the guilt. Ron admitted he kept asking himself questions that had no answers. Should I have called more often? Should I have visited sooner? Should I have said certain things differently? He knew rationally that none of it would have changed the outcome. But grief doesn't listen to logic. It invents blame when it has nowhere else to go. What haunted Ron most was the randomness of it all. Rob was still full of plans, still engaged, still passionate, still very much alive in spirit. There was no slow goodbye, no chance to prepare, just sudden violence and irreversible silence. And the image that broke Ron every time was Rob's family. He spoke softly when mentioning Michele Singer. Michele Singer. Michele had always been kind to him, warm, grounded, the steady presence beside Rob that made everything else feel balanced. To imagine her gone in such a brutal way was something Ron said his mind still refused to fully accept. But nothing devastated him more than thinking about Rob's daughter, a child witnessing the unthinkable. Ron paused for a long time before speaking about that, long enough that the silence itself felt heavy. He said no parent should ever imagine their child seeing such horror, and no child should ever carry that memory for the rest of their life. That thought alone kept him awake at night. He admitted that grief had begun to spill into every part of his life. He found it hard to focus, hard to work, hard even to enjoy moments that should have brought comfort. Simple things like hearing laughter on set suddenly reminded him of the laughter he would never hear from Rob again. And for the first time in years, Ron said he questioned something deeply personal. How much loss can one person absorb before it changes who they are? He didn't say it dramatically. He didn't say it for sympathy. He said it because it was the truth. The man the public saw, calm and composed, was not the man sitting alone at night. That man was grieving. That man was shaken. That man was trying to understand how someone so integral to his life could vanish so violently, so suddenly. Ron looked straight at the interviewer and said something that stayed in the air long after he spoke. Some losses don't heal, they don't fade, they simply become part of you. And Rob Reiner, he said, would forever be one of those losses. After the interview ended, Ron Howard didn't feel relief. He felt empty. He later admitted that the speaking about Rob out loud didn't lessen the pain. In some ways, it made it sharper. Saying the words forced him to accept what his mind had been resisting since the moment he heard the news, that Rob Reiner was truly gone. In the days that followed, Ron began pulling away from the world, not dramatically, not in a way people would notice immediately. He still showed up when he had to, still answered messages, still smiled when cameras were pointed in his direction. But inside, something had changed. He stopped reaching out the way he used to. Conversations felt exhausting. Even well-meaning condolences began to feel unbearable, because every expression of sympathy reopened the same wound. Every "I'm so sorry" reminded him of a reality he would have preferred not to face at all. Ron has said grief doesn't always look like tears. Sometimes it looks like silence. He found himself sitting for long stretches, doing nothing. No television, no music, no scripts. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears and forces you to listen to your own thoughts. And those thoughts weren't kind. They drifted back to moments he hadn't thought about in years, early projects, long discussions about the storytelling, arguments that ended in laughter, Rob challenging him creatively, pushing him to be better, never out of ego, but out of respect. Ron realized something painful in that stillness. There was no one else who filled that role in his life. Rob had been the person he could call without an agenda, without pressure, without performance. In an industry built on image, Rob was real. And now that voice was gone. The loss began affecting Ron physically. He admitted his sleep was restless. Nights were filled with half dreams and sudden awakenings. His mind would replay fragments of conversations, then abruptly remember there would never be another one. Morning brought no relief. He described waking up with a heavy sensation in his chest, as if grief had weight, as if it sat there, unmoving, reminding him that this wasn't something he could outrun by staying busy. What frightened him most was how permanent it felt. This wasn't sadness that came and went. It settled in. Ron said he began to understand something about grief that no one ever explains properly. You don't get over it. You don't move on. You learn to carry it, whether you want to or not. And carrying Rob's loss felt overwhelming. Friends encouraged him to distract himself, to throw himself back into work, to focus on new projects. But Ron knew distraction wasn't healing. It was avoidance. And avoidance only delayed the moment when grief demands to be felt. So he allowed it. He let himself remember Rob fully, not just the public figure, not the successful filmmaker, but the man behind closed doors, the friend who listened, the person who cared deeply, worried deeply, loved deeply. And that's when another realization hit him. Rob's death wasn't just an ending. It was a mirror It forced Ron to confront his own vulnerability, his own mortality, the fragile truth that no amount of success protects you from sudden loss, that life can fracture without warning, even when everything seems stable. That realization scared him more than he expected, because for the first time in a long while, Ron didn't feel in control, and that loss of control may have been the hardest part of all. As the weeks passed, Ron Howard noticed something unsettling. The memories wouldn't fade, they multiplied. Everywhere he turned, something reminded him of Rob Reiner, a line of dialogue in a script, a creative disagreement on set, even a joke overheard in passing. Each one opened a door he hadn't meant to walk through. Ron said, memory can be a comfort, but it can also be a punishment. Because with Rob gone, memory no longer brought warmth. It brought longing, it brought regret. It brought the painful awareness that the past was the only place Rob still existed. He found himself replaying specific conversations, obsessing over details he had once ignored. The tone of Rob's voice, the way he laughed mid-sentence, the pauses where Rob would think before speaking, choosing his words carefully. Those small details became unbearable. Ron admitted that some nights he wished he could erase parts of his memory just to escape the ache. But he also knew that erasing those memories would mean losing Rob all over again, and that thought was even worse. What haunted him most were the conversations toward the end. Rob had opened up more than usual. He spoke about family, about fear, about how fragile life felt as he grew older. At the time, Ron listened like a friend does, without realizing those words would soon become final. Now, those conversations echoed in his head with a cruel clarity. Ron said he felt trapped between gratitude and torment, grateful that Rob trusted him enough to share those thoughts, tormented because hearing them now felt like reopening a wound that would never close. He confessed something deeply personal during a quiet moment off camera. Part of him wished he had told Rob more, not professionally, not creatively, but personally. How much he mattered, how much he was valued, how deeply he was loved as a friend. Ron knew Rob likely felt it, but grief has a way of making certainty feel inadequate. It demands proof, even when proof no longer matters. And then there was the anger, not rage, not blame directed at a person, but a quiet, simmering anger at the randomness of it all, at how violence had stolen someone who still had so much to give, at how quickly everything could be taken away without reason or mercy. Ron said anger and grief often coexist, even when we don't want them to. He struggled with that anger because it didn't fit his public image. He wasn't supposed to feel it, but denying it only made it stronger. So he acknowledged it privately, in the only way he knew how, by sitting with it, by letting it exist, by admitting that some losses don't make sense and never will. As he reflected, Ron realized something painful but true. Rob's absence had created a silence in his life that could never be filled. No new friendship would replace it. No future collaboration would erase it. This wasn't a chapter closing, it was a permanent gap. And accepting that truth felt like another loss entirely. By the time the shock settled into something quieter, Ron Howard realized he wasn't the same person he had been before the loss. Grief hadn't just hurt him, it had altered him. He began noticing subtle changes in how he moved through the world. Conversations felt more fragile. Moments felt more temporary. Even joy carried an edge now, as if he were constantly aware of how quickly it could disappear. Ron said losing Rob Reiner stripped away an illusion he didn't know he still had. The illusion that time is generous, that there will always be another call, another dinner, another chance to say what matters. Suddenly, everything felt urgent. He found himself reaching out to people he hadn't spoken to in years, not to talk about work, not to reminisce, just to check in, to hear a voice, to remind himself that connection, however brief, was still possible. And yet, even as he did that, the absence of Rob remained constant. Ron described it as carrying an invisible weight, one that no one else could see, but that he felt with every step. Public appearances became harder, not because of the crowd, but because of the expectation to be okay. He wasn't okay. He admitted that there were moments when he felt almost guilty for continuing his life as normal, for laughing, for planning future projects, for waking up to days Rob would never get to see. Grief, he said, creates contradictions you can't resolve. You want to honor the person you lost by living fully, but living fully feels like betrayal when someone you love can no longer do the same. Ron spoke quietly about how Rob's death forced him to confront his own mortality in a way nothing else ever had. Not abstractly, not philosophically, but personally, viscerally. He began asking himself questions he had long avoided. What actually matters when the noise fades? What relationships deserve more time than they get? What words are we postponing that should be said now? Rob's absence became a constant reminder that postponement is a luxury no one is guaranteed. And yet, amid the pain, something else emerged. Clarity. Ron realized that Rob's greatest gift wasn't just his talent or his friendship. It was the way he lived with intention, the way he cared deeply, spoke honestly, and never treated relationships as disposable. That realization didn't erase the grief, but it gave it meaning. Ron said he would carry Rob with him, not as a wound, but as a guide, a quiet presence reminding him to show up, to speak honestly, to love people while they are still here. Even so, he admitted the nights were still hard, the silence still heavy, the memories still sharp. Healing, he said, wasn't a destination. It was learning how to walk forward without leaving someone behind. And Rob Reiner would always walk with him. In the end, Ron Howard said there was no clean resolution to grief, no final scene, no closing credits, no moment where the pain politely steps aside and lets life return to what it was before. Because some goodbyes don't arrive all at once. They arrive slowly in quiet moments, in unexpected reminders, in the absence you feel when you reach for the phone and realize there's no one left to call. Ron admitted that even months later, he still caught himself thinking, I should tell Rob this, a new idea, a funny story, a worry he would have understood immediately. And then the truth returned. Rob wasn't there. Rob Reiner had become memory, presence turned into echo, a voice that lived on only in Ron's mind and heart. But Ron refused to let that be the end of the story. He said that honoring Rob didn't mean freezing in sorrow. It meant carrying forward the values Rob lived by: honesty, loyalty, creative courage, and above all, humanity. Ron made a quiet promise to himself. He would stop postponing what mattered, stop assuming time was endless, stop treating people like they'd always be there, because Rob wasn't. And that truth, painful as it was, had sharpened Ron's sense of purpose. He spoke about continuing his work not as an escape, but as a tribute. Every project, every collaboration, every story told with care became a way of saying Rob's influence hadn't vanished. It had simply changed form. Ron also acknowledged something difficult. Grief doesn't shrink. We grow around it. The hole Rob left would never close, but over time, life would expand around that emptiness, making a space for meaning, gratitude, and remembrance alongside the pain. When asked how he wanted people to remember Rob Reiner, Ron didn't talk about awards or box office numbers. He talked about kindness, about integrity, about a man who showed up for his friends, not just his career. And in that moment, Ron's voice steadied, not because the pain was gone, but because he had accepted it. Rob Reiner's death marked the end of a chapter, but not the end of the bond they shared. Some friendships don't end when life does. They settle deeper. They become part of who you are. And for Ron Howard, Rob Reiner would forever remain not just a colleague, not just a friend, but a presence that time itself could not erase.